Okay, dear colleagues, welcome to the ninth seminar in our seminar series on social role of colleges across the globe. I first wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and this meeting place, and today this is still the meeting place and home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we, as members of the university, are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This seminar series is organized by Professor Lisa Wheelahan, Professor Gavin Moody, and myself, Jacob Cost, with the support of the Center of the Study of Canadian and International Higher Education at OISE of the University of Toronto, and special thanks to the graduate assistants, CU Lee, Erin Anderson, and Ahmed Su for their great support. This series explores the important role that community colleges and similar institutions play in supporting social, education, and cultural development in their local communities and regions. And we argue that the role colleges play is not as well understood or theorized as is the role of universities and schools, and that this matters because colleges are vital for the well-being of their local communities. They support their regions, communities in many often invisible ways. However, the ways in which they do so differs in different countries and systems, and that's why the speaker series includes speakers from very different systems. Until now, the speaker series featured great presentations on developments in the college sector in Canada, France, Switzerland, Finland, the United States, Germany, UK, and Chile. And you can access all these previous presentations and recordings on our website, and I'll post afterwards the link in the chat. We are very happy to continue this series with a talk from our today's speaker, Dr. Stephen Hodge, with the title Eroding: Social Role of Vocational Education in Australia. Stephen Hodge is a curriculum researcher based at Griffith University, Queensland in Australia. He has a special interest in vocational education and the ways occupational expertise is represented in curriculum. And recently he has been considering how vocational educators interact with centrally formulated curriculum. And Stephen is deputy head of the school in the School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith, and is deputy director of the Griffith Institute for Educational Research. Stephen has an extensive publication list, and I will just point out the new book that a very dear colleague of mine, Barbara Stalder from Switzerland, and he and others co-edited, The Standing of Vocational Education and the Occupation It Served, Current Concerns and Strategies for Enhancing That Standing, by Springer. So check this out. It's really a great book, guys. So before we start, just a quick reminder, if you have any questions during the talk, please post them in the chat, and Dr. Hodge will be happy to answer your question after this talk. So thank you very much for making this possible, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and welcome to everyone from sunny Brisbane. It's just after 8 o'clock in the morning here. The sun is shining, there's a light breeze, it's lovely and warm. I've already been for a swim this morning, and my heart goes out to you in Toronto, where it might not be quite like that. Thank you especially to Lisa for reaching out to me in the first instance and initiating this presentation today. The focus of this presentation is on the way the social role of vocational education has been eroded in Australia. Thinking about the presentation, I want to say that I've had to skim a a large amount of information to get to the presentation. So I cover a lot of ground and make generalizations. The number of references is relatively low. I prepared a large reference list that goes over several pages for anyone who's interested in the details behind the ideas that we look at today. What I'll do first, though, is acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land from which I'm presenting today, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Just to briefly overview the session, the session is about Australian vocational education. We will look at some terms, and it is always interesting to look at how the terminology around colleges and post-compulsory education and tertiary education in some countries and vocational education in Australia are considered, and how they relate to each other. So we will look at some key terms for the presentation and a little tiny bit of history. Then we'll go to a consideration of some important ideas that sit behind contemporary Australian vocational education. We'll then look at how these ideas, or the ramification of these ideas, has led to the erosion of the social role of vocational education in Australia. And right at the end, I offer some reflections on where we might go in the future. But that's just a small part of the presentation. We'll mostly be focusing on how that social role has been eroded. Some terminology. So during the presentation, I'll refer regularly to vocational education, and by that I mean all education that relates to a person's working life. Now, vocational education is, of course, packaged up in all sorts of different ways. Right now in Australia, we mostly refer to VET, or vocational education and training, and that's the common term for competency-based vocational education provision in Australia. Now, of course, there's a very large amount of vocational education provided entirely outside the system in Australia. So I've mentioned here that we have a competency-based vocational education system, but there is so much vocational education that is not competency-based in Australia. And of course, there's a gradation from formal through to all kinds of informal vocational education, of course. Now, in Australia, we have institutes of technical and further education, or TAFEs. TAFEs are public colleges of vocational education and operate within the Australian vocational education and training system. So in Australia, it's quite natural to talk about TAFEs. They've been established for a very long time in Australia, and just bear in mind that if I'm talking about TAFE, that we're talking about the public colleges of vocational education in Australia. Now, the wider classification for providers of vocational education and training in Australia is registered training providers, or RTOs. RTOs. So this is a formal term. In effect, it does cover TAFEs. So TAFEs are registered training providers, RTOs, but it's more common to use the term RTO to apply to private providers within the vocational education system. Just noting that we also have an adult and community education, or ACE, sector. However, it's a very small sector and it's a fragmented sector. It has a footprint in the state of Victoria that's considerable and distinctive, but the same cannot be said of other jurisdictions within Australia. So I won't be talking much at all about ACE, apart from noting that it has been, in Victoria at least, subsumed by the vocational education and training system, and really operates at the periphery of the latter system. So there are some terms, and I'm very aware that in Canada, for one, we talk about colleges, and I guess the closest to the colleges in that sense are TAFEs in Australia. A very quick look at the Australian post-compulsory landscape. This landscape is strongly structured by a binary of higher and vocational education. And this binary shows up in various ways. For example, if we look at the Australian qualifications framework, we see a split between VET, vocational education and training, and higher education. And what I've done there is just lifted a fairly common diagram that represents the levels of the Australian qualifications framework. You'll see there on the left, from 1 to 10, from the bottom to top. Vocational education and training is generally playing out in those first 5 levels of the Australian qualifications framework. And I've put a red box around those qualifications. And in the main, higher education plays out in the top 5 levels of the Australian qualifications framework, and I put a red box around there. So today we're talking about vocational education and training, and just note that in terms of the Australian compulsory education, post-compulsory education sector, VET operates at those first 5 levels of the Australian qualifications framework. For the purpose of today's presentation, I'm going to isolate a few moments in the history of Australian vocational education. Now, the system that we're talking about, the contemporary system, is a product of reforms that were set in train in the late 1980s. But prior to those reforms, vocational education in Australia has a complicated and very interesting history. I must note that a history of First Nations learning and education is yet to be written. There are articles and chapters we can refer to, but we don't have a definitive history there. When we're talking about the colonial era, apprenticeship style vocational education was brought by the English and served the purposes of vocational education for a long time. Then other models were superimposed on the apprenticeship system, such as mechanics institutes, workers' educational associations, technical colleges, etc. There are some histories of this period that we can consult. Now, we must note that in Australia, like other countries, we have a federal system of government, and it's important to note that vocational education has traditionally been a state government concern, except under special circumstances. So, and we're just looking at the history here. So if we look at around the First World War and the Second World War, these were times when the federal government, the Commonwealth government, took a particular interest in vocational education. And so we saw a more national approach during those times of crisis. But it took until the 1970s before something like a national identity was formed for vocational education and training. So the Commonwealth government was the first attempted to impose a national identity upon vocational education in the 1970s. So we had a progressivist Labor government in the 1970s, and a number of reforms were initiated, and these reforms include the birth of of a distinctive national vocational education sector, also called the TAFE sector, Technical and Further Education. And this sector was envisaged and articulated in its initial form through the work of Maya Kangan and a team who prepared the very famous Kangan report. And that report defines vocational education in various ways and promotes a vision of a system that would serve individuals, communities, and employers. I note that there has been some searching analysis of the legacy of the Kangan report. It has been argued, for example, that the Kangan report did not introduce a humanist vision of vocational education and training in Australia. And I think if you look at this report, it's a large report. It's probably true that there are several visions of vocational education vying for dominance there. However, if we look at the introduction to the Kangan report, we get some indications about the nature of vocational education. And I'll read these out. The main purpose of education is the betterment and development of individual people and their contribution to the good of the community. Technical and further education should be planned accordingly. And another quote from that same page: it is important that general education be seen as relevant to vocational purposes, and that vocational education in turn becomes more general in its content and methods, so that people can be better prepared to adapt themselves to changing conditions and to retraining as necessary at any time of their working lives. So this Kangan vision of Australian vocational education and training was adopted and implemented in Australia, and for around a decade, this vision dominated the growing Australian vocational education and training sector, the TAFE sector. Why we're looking at this here, I wouldn't argue that there was anything like a golden age of vocational education in Australia, that there was a time when the social role was distinct and championed, and all vocational education played out in the light of that vision. But it is interesting that there was a time when the purpose of vocational education was construed in a broad way, that the good of the individual, the good of the community, and also the more narrowly vocational purpose of technical education were combined in a kind of composite vision. Now, this is where we come to the crux of the presentation today. In the 1980s, a second wave of national vocational education reform commenced. This is the so-called National Training Reform Agenda. And it is really part of a suite of reforms across Australian government during the late 1980s. So there was most definitely economic and social challenges facing Australian governments through the 1980s. And if we look at policy reform across that time, multiple sectors were being reconceptualized by policymakers. So this is something I think it's important to just recognise that training reform in Australia was just one direction of reform, and that there were multiple types of reform taking place at around the same time. Now, the arguments for national training reform are of real interest to us today. An early argument for vocational education reform was presented by Ministers Dawkins and Holding, and it's really Minister John Dawkins who was the kind of author of the National Training Reform Agenda, or its leading its leading thinker, I suppose. We see some of the flavour of these reforms when we look at the forward to Skilling Australia, one of the first policy papers that announced training reform. And I'll read from it. The government is determined that our education and training systems should play an active role in responding to the major economic challenges now facing Australia. The adjustments required in the structure of the economy and improvements in Australia's international competitiveness will make heavy demands on our human resources and labour force skills. Our skills formation and training arrangements are not yet adequate to meet those demands. The world's most successful economies over the past 2 decades have given high priority to education, skills, and competence at work as vital factors in economic performance, and have supported their skills development policies accordingly. Now we must do likewise. And I just want to draw attention to this idea of skills formation as a focus for these reforms. It's a really, really important concept, as we'll see. So we'll delve now into some key elements of the training reform agenda. And these elements are the reconceptualisation of the purpose of vocational education in Australia, positioning industry as leader of the vocational education system, the adoption of competency-based training as a system-wide curriculum model, and the marketisation of vocational education provision. First, looking at the purpose of vocational education, we saw from that brief excerpt from the Kangan report that vocational education was defined broadly and in more or less traditional terms. But now, with the National Training Reform Agenda, the focus becomes quite sharp. And we're talking about a conceptualisation of vocational education around economic, in economic terms. As I pointed out from the previous slide, national skills formation became the focus. Disadvantaged people and unemployed people are mentioned in those policy documents. They were policy documents from Australian Labor ministers, after all. But the way that disadvantage is described, is conceptualized, is interesting. And in these policies, we're talking about addressing disadvantage with a view of fuller participation in the workforce. Now, if we dig further into the economic rationale for vocational education and training, it was assumed that national prosperity would automatically produce social benefits. So, in other words, if VET is reoriented to economic ends, the system will ultimately fulfill a social role. And that's a really, really interesting set of assumptions. It's to be noted that human capital theory supports this repurposing of VET. So if we dig into the ideas of Becker and others, we can see that there is there's a certain consistency between human capital theory and its idea of the social good and the way these reforms played out in Australia. Going now to the idea of industry leadership of vocational education, a really important point is that there was a certain way of portraying pre-reform vocational education and training. Clearly, it's important for strong reforms like those announced by Dawkins to have a straw man version of what went before reform. The straw man in this case is these educators, or it seems to me, educators. Educators had captured vocational education and training and were imposing their interests on the system, and of course had too much influence over vocational education, and that was one of the reasons why it wasn't supporting a competitive national economy. Or that's the story anyway. There's almost no evidence for any of that in reality, but this is the way we make arguments for reform. Now, if educators are to be decentered, who will lead the vocational education and training system? Well, for those reformers, industry would fulfill that role. So industry is conceptualized as the new leader for VET. However, there's a range of issues that spring up here. First of all, it is not necessarily clear what industry is. To this day, it's unclear what industry is. To say industry, it's an industry-led system is a statement that invites the question, what is industry? And that's very, very difficult to pin down. We have large, powerful bodies now that represent industry, that represent employers. But that representation isn't complete, and there's room for research into what industry means, how industry is represented, how democratic that whole process really is. I think an even more problematic point here is that it is not necessarily the case that industry, whatever that is, would know, or let us say employers, it's not necessarily the case that employers know what they need from VET. Of course, employers will know that they need people with certain skills, and they might have a really good idea of what those skills are. But it's a big step then to knowing what a vocational education system would need to do to build those skills. So, for instance, if we think about taxonomic analyses of vocational knowledge, we're talking about significant expertise to use taxonomies to analyse tasks, functions, skills, capabilities, and the like. And that's if you buy that kind of approach to determining what a vocational curriculum would look like. It makes little sense to ask industry people about what should go into a vocational education curriculum. But apart from that as well, there is the huge question, do industry interests coincide with public interests? Well, I'll leave that question with you. I think it's quite clear that there's a complicated debate to be had about that. But at any rate, if we look at this element of national training reform, industry leadership of vocational education is something that really does need a lot more scrutiny. Secondly, if we look at, third, if we look at competency-based training, or the Australian version of it, competency-based training, there's a lot to be said about it, but for the context we're in, the presentation, I'll just focus on a few things. We can look at competency-based training, which is a distinctive, multifaceted model for education. In this case, we can look at it as an instrument of industry leadership of VET. And the way that it becomes an instrument of industry leadership is that it is a way of generating curriculum that focuses on immediately applicable, narrowly construed skills. So there is the idea that vocational education should equip students with the ability to walk out of the door of the TAFE or private provider and into an industry context and start working straight away. They'll be competent and be able to work in that environment with very little further input from employers. Of course, that's a fiction. Graduates from vocational education and training in Australia take a lot of time to adjust to a real workplace, and very often their training in an RTO doesn't really prepare them for what they will need to do. So there are all sorts of problems that arise if we build our curriculum in vocational education from what we know about immediately applicable, narrowly construed skills. And some of these problems include the rapid redundancy of learning. Because things move fairly quickly in some industries, not so quickly in others, but fairly quickly overall, we have rapid redundancy of learning, which follows from that focus on immediately applicable skills. At the same time, this kind of approach to generating vocational education curriculum constrains mobility. And just by that, I'm referring to the ability to work in different kinds of workplaces, in types of roles that aren't, strictly speaking, envisaged by the creators of curriculum. And there's constraints also in terms of moving, for example, into higher education programs. This is a very big issue. People who are prepared in a vocational education environment in Australia often struggle to progress in a higher education environment. And it's really the competency-based curriculum that they've worked in that creates the problem here. There's another problem, and this is a more theoretical problem. I'm sorry if you can hear the garbage truck that's just pulled up out the front. The competency-based training has the effect of smothering important forms of knowledge for a person's future development. Lisa, who is here today, of course, has written about the way competency-based training undermines the acquisition of powerful knowledge. But just a small example, electricians need to know quite a bit of mathematics to work and thrive in those roles. Competency-based training, as we have it in Australia, has a way of fragmenting forms of knowledge that are broader than the modules of competency-based curriculum. So the modularization and the way that training providers can mix those modules up into almost any order has the effect of blocking access to those forms of disciplinary knowledge where they are relevant to vocations, and they are relevant to a number of vocations. Competency-based training also limits the agency of educators. To my mind, this is a huge problem. It's not actually central to our discussion today, but it's worth considering that if we do limit the agency of educators through a system like competency-based training, then the ability of educators to respond to the needs of learners, of diverse learners, of individual learners, is reduced for various reasons. And finally, a system like we have in Australia, the competency-based system we have in Australia, creates difficulties for accommodating local conditions and practices. Of course, an employer in a far-flung regional setting may practice differently than an employer in a metropolitan setting. Within the one industry, there are diverse ways of practicing. Our competency-based system makes it difficult to accommodate diverse practices and conditions in actual workplaces. So we could go, I certainly could go on and on about competency-based training, but here are a few ways in which it undermines certain goals that can be envisaged for vocational education. The last element we look at is the marketisation of vocational education and training in Australia. Now, private provision has grown massively through the marketisation of VET in Australia. I've lifted a graph from the work of Phil Toner. Phil Toner is an economist with a particular interest in how economic ideas can be applied to areas like education. So with the growth of private provision of public vocational education and training, the one important consequence is that the focus of public providers has shifted. So what we see is public providers needing to, well, in many cases, compete with each other and compete with private providers of vocational education and training. So this new environment has dramatically shifted the focus of public providers, and a number of other a number of issues come with this shift of focus. One of the problems that we have is a dramatic de-skilling of the education workforce within public providers. So, for example, the ability to develop curriculum resources has atrophied significantly through this period. But it also means that the management of public providers has become oriented to other goals. And of course, that flows down into the way that educators practice and the experiences that learners have. So the way that public providers have been changed through marketisation is dramatic and worrying. However, we're seeing some signs of change there over the last few years in Australia and in Victoria in particular, where public providers have been better resourced than they have in the past, and governments have seen the value of explicitly supporting public providers. So there's cause to be a little optimistic there. Continuing with the theme of marketisation, the policy documents, one for example I showed you earlier, the policy documents talk about marketisation as a way to expand provision. So some of those early arguments, the arguments of the 1980s, were that we would need a lot more training than we've had, and to get a jump start on the problem that was seen to be coming, we'd need to bring private providers into the system somehow. So those kinds of arguments were offered for the marketisation of vocational education and training. But people like Phil Toner have deeper and darker interpretations of marketisation. But just from, if we look at marketisation, a range of problems have been noted at different levels. For example, the VET regulator in Australia, the main one being the Australian Skills Quality Authority, has published on problems that ultimately spring from the marketisation of vocational education and training. So the collapsing of courses into very small timeframes, so very short courses, has been a result of marketisation facilitated by competency-based training, and the VET regulator has grappled with that problem, that kind of shrinkage of course length. Employer associations too have remarked on quality problems which again stem from marketisation. I've mentioned the work of Phil Toner in the presentation, and I think it's interesting to see from an economist's perspective how marketisation is failing in Australian vocational education and training. So in 2018, Phil Toner produced a couple of publications which spell out problems from an economist's point of view. And so some of these problems are, first, poor market information to consumers. So a theoretically functional market assumes that we have rational consumers who are receive information about the market and can make good choices because the information's good, right? But as Toner points out, the flow of information, so this is all conceptualized in economic theory terms, the flow of information is particularly poor in the case of Australian vocational education and training. And partly due to that, but partly due to structural reasons, the choice that consumers of vocational education and training have is restricted. The choices that are supposed to be free are actually quite distorted in the system that we have. Toner also has a well-developed argument about how the incentive structures in the Australian training market has actually created a market for low-quality training. Going back to the point I made about short courses, shorter courses in many cases equal poor quality training, and there are a range of other ways in which the quality of training has declined in some parts of Australian vocational education and training, and it's really the incentive structures from an economic point of view that contribute to that. Barriers to entry and exit to the market, that refers to how very easy it is for a firm to enter the vocational education and training market. In many cases, a business won't need much investment in order to move into the market, and it's easy to exit the market as well. So from an economist's point of view, that creates an interesting mindset for those contemplating vocational education and training as a place to generate profits. There's second last there, regulators are extremely constrained in this environment. We're talking about a very large number of very small training providers, and the national regulator has limited resources for policing the system, and that leads to problems of its own. And as Toner has analysed, there's been a reduced level of government funding overall. And indeed, right back at those in those policy documents of the 1980s, there was an interest expressed in containing the costs of training, given what was then envisaged as a massive expansion of vocational education. Now, other people have argued that marketisation has been more benign in its influence on Australian vocational education and training. However, to my mind, the balance of attention to this point is that it's a problem. It's a significant problem. So coming back to the overarching focus of the presentation on the erosion of the social role of vocational education, let's pull some of these ideas together and consider a few things. So first of all, of a population of 25.7 million in 2021, these are the latest figures, 4.3 million participated in the VET system. So it is a large system. A lot of Australians are involved in it. And so, of course, a social role of vocational education is something that is obvious and something that we really must be thinking about. However, the dominance of the economic discourse serves to crowd out alternative conceptualizations of vocational education. It is a powerful discourse, and it is quite it's quite hard to dislodge those concerns around national prosperity, the idea of competitiveness and the like. These ideas are deeply ingrained. Industry leadership has promoted the interests of capital at considerable public costs. So in the latest figures, the Australian public contributed 10.4 billion to vocational education in 2021. Now, to my mind, that really signals a problem, that we have that level of public investment serving essentially to save employers the need to develop people to operate their machines and their processes. Maybe it's a very deep problem. Going to competency-based training, we were talking about this before, this limits the educational outcomes for learners and has served to de-skill the teaching workforce. Really, competency-based courses, and I've studied at least 4, or when I say at least, some with several updates, and there is a strangely dulling effect that these programs have, or at least on me. So I think there's a real problem here, and that the educational experience of learners is undermined by competency-based training. And talking about undermining, marketisation has also undermined the quality of vocational education in Australia. Glancing toward the future, I think it is clear that we need sophisticated debate about the role of vocational education. So when we think about vocational education, if we're talking, especially in a context where for decades a certain way of thinking about vocational education has dominated, we have to really question, and we have to ignite our imaginations to think about alternatives even. I think that if we consider the social role of vocational education, then that would be a useful starting point for the kind of debate that we need to have about vocational education. Now, I think it's reasonably clear that industry and employers have a role in vocational education, but should it be the dominant one? That's a good question, I think. Also, sophisticated forms of curriculum and pedagogy are demanded by contemporary conditions. A competency-based approach has probably seen it's had its day, as we would say. It might have served certain purposes in the past, but I don't think we can say the same of the current environment. And finally, marketisation needs to be fundamentally contested and rethought. As Tony would argue, reformers had a limited grasp on the economic theories that they were using, and a half-digested economic theory is a bad way to design, for example, markets. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'll hand back to Jacob.
Thank you very much. It was absolutely fantastic. A great presentation and a lot of impulses for discussion. So you could stop sharing your screen probably, then we see more faces. And Lisa already opened the mic, so I wish for stay.
Thank you, Stephen, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I really liked the way you posed the point at the end that thinking about the social role of colleges would be an important generative impulse for rethinking vocational education. What do you think that would look like if we did? How would the role of TAFEs be rethought? Because what we're seeing at the moment in Australia is a reinvestment in TAFE by Labor governments, by Labor state governments, but are they thinking more broadly about this social role of colleges, or is it still a fairly narrow conception of what the purposes of vocational education should be, which is supplicant to primarily employer requirements?
Lisa, I would say, unfortunately, the latter is the case. A sophisticated debate about vocational education is not what we have in Australia. But I was saying before that there's reasons to be optimistic. The thing will be to seize this moment to open up the debate. Unfortunately, the way that the resources are flowing back to public vocational education and training, to the colleges, is not coming with the impulse to really think about what we're doing. And remember that to even have such a debate, we need to roll back. We need not to go back to a golden age or anything like that, but we need to unstick some of these orthodoxies about the point of vocational education and training, and especially a narrow understanding of vocational education and training as preparing people for immediate employment. That I think is a hard one to shift. It sounds, common sense would dictate that that's probably what we would do in a vocational education setting. But really, when that is pursued literally, it produces extremely narrow outcomes.
Okay, thank you. So we have parallel discussion, one in the chat and one live, but we go on with a live one. Robin Shreve, yeah.
Yeah, just could I say thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks very much, Lisa. Could I say there's one small glimmer of hope, and I'm talking about New South Wales in terms of the social role. One of the consequences of lots of free courses, there's been a lot of publicity about English language courses, especially for Ukrainian refugees, which is actually sort of widened the role. And I think it's a great thing, because having spoken to some of these Ukrainian refugees, they've gone to TAFE and it's opened up a whole wide opportunity. However, some critical points is, unfortunately, I don't think free courses are the answer, because certainly the systems I'm most familiar with are in desperate need of renewal and reinvestment in things like teacher education and revitalisation. And free courses, it's just going to be more of the same. And the other thing about it is, I just sort of point out, The 4.3 million enrolments is a bit misleading because over 2 million of those are in short courses. And the biggest short course is actually first aid. And the biggest provider in first aid is a company nobody's ever heard of called Australia-wide First Aid, who's only got 3 qualifications on scope: first aid and CPR in single units. So if you convert it to EFT, vet is far, far, far smaller than the higher education sector in Australia, which I think is sort of indicative of the climb. So there are reasons to be cheerful, but I do think that it's not a question of just more courses. It's a question about reinvigoration of the system as well and development of the system. Thanks, that's great.
Can I just say something there? Yes, so Robin, I think I was quite careful in that slide to point out this many people participate in the system. Yeah. Yes, of course, in terms of full-time enrolments, the number is much smaller. But I do think that many people having contact with the system means that the system has quite an influence. And so for example, competency-based training is something that has extreme reach through those numbers. But you're entirely right. If we're talking about people spending all day in a training institution, the numbers are smaller.
Yeah, can I just say, I think it's something research, because when I started to look, and the NCVI won't actually give provider details, the thing about first aid certificates, you have to redo them every other year. So there's a lot of repeat. It's a good business model for this provider. There's a lot of repeat business. So are you hitting the same people all the time?
Yes.
I think when I looked at the numbers, like it doesn't take into account the increase in the enrolments in the states where there's been a reinvestment in TAFE in the last couple of years. But when I looked in 2020, which wasn't that long ago, the number of hours of training was the same as in 2008. So, you know, we had a massive rise in the number of hours, a massive rise in the number of providers. Then the market crashed and burned. And so, you know, 12 years later, the system wasn't actually any bigger, but what we had seen is a fundamental redistribution of of who provided that training. So TAFE's share had dramatically shrunk, whereas private providers had dramatically increased. And at the same time, over that same period of time, universities' enrolments went up by 34%. So,
yeah, can I just say that if you want to look at this, the NCVR for overseas colleagues has wonderful statistics, and it has a wonderful thing called the data slicer, where you can actually pull out very easily statistics by provider, by course, by unit, by hours. So, you know, it's excellent along those terms. So, I mean, I would agree with that. And the other thing is, Lisa, as you know, the TAFE system is less than a third of the vet sector in Australia now. And if you look at Queensland, I was really shocked by the statistics of Queensland TAFE compared to the private providers. And that's probably, you know, one of those states. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Probably. And Charles, do you want to switch your chat discussion to, or probably first Kevin again, or Kevin, and then switch to your chat discussion? Is that okay?
Yes. So, first of all, I'd like to say really interesting presentation, and it made me realize that there was sort of a parallel policy conversation taking place both sides of the world. So here there was the Vision 2000 conversation, and that led to sort of various reports called People and Skills with additional abbreviations, and that led to some changes in our college system here too. But I was wondering, considering the argument that you were making about sort of a need for the conversation to expand, and I wondered whether the UN Sustainable Goals, number 4 is quality education, number 11 is about sustainable cities and communities, whether it provides an opportunity to reopen that conversation, to expand it, and to really engage in debate about the role that technical and vocational education can actually play into sustainability overall. And I was wondering whether or not it could also be phrased in terms of urgency, considering the pace of technological change. And I think it would be true to say that, you know, everybody's concerned with the pace of AI, how that's transforming education in all modes at the moment. And I just really appreciate your spin on that. Thank you.
Great questions, Anne. Okay, it would be great if the UN goals became a topic and we deeply considered how they might be addressed through vocational education and training in Australia. But I'm a little bit wary there. For example, the institution I work in, Griffith University, we subscribe to those goals. And what happens at the level of teaching and curriculum is that they are fragmented down into measurable indicators, and then educators resist them in various ways because of that granularity and that kind of imposition over the top of other forms of curriculum. And then we get a bifurcated perspective on those goals, which make perfect sense and are a wonderful thing. But when you get a system like how higher education is set up in Australia, these goals can be taken in a certain way and broken down and operationalized in a certain way that is perhaps in conflict with the intent of those goals. So just the way systems work, and really Australian vocational education and training could be a worse case, that once you got those goals and turn them, for instance, into, well, I mean, what alternatives do we have? Make competencies out of them. So we end up with units of competency that articulate and refract those goals, and the system works as it was. You know what I mean? So I think it's a really, really good question, but I think that the way our systems work, it makes it a very complicated point to pursue.
So lots of resistancy, organizational structures. Yeah,
quite possibly. I would say it would be anything but straightforward. We know all about those goals, and you know, you can rhetorically honour them all you like, but if you've got a system, for example, like competency-based training or a marketised system, it has to go in a certain direction. So it's that those we have to attack the problem at the level of those systems. So the questions become different.
Sure. So it needs a policy window. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Your mic is still muted.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Stephen, for excellently laying the framework for the challenges that we're considering. I wish to make two observations about the distinctiveness of Australian vocational education, which I don't think are very well appreciated within Australia, let alone outside. So in North America, we have CIHEs, community colleges, which are substantial institutions. They have a vocational function, they have a transfer function, they're almost all public. The college system is that. That's what public policy focuses on. That's what public funding is concerned with. There is, quite outside that, private career colleges, all fee for service, as we would say in Australia, all fees or by contract to employer, unregulated, unfunded by government, no quality assurance, no accreditation. In Australia, those two aspects of provision are one. Australia is a vocational education and training sector where, as Stephen has presented to us, the aim has been to submerge the differences between the public college sector and the private career training colleges. And a lot of the difficulties that Stephen was referring to arise from successive Australian and state governments trying to establish policy, quality assurance, accreditation, and finance arrangements to deal with this almost 4,000 private for-profit career colleges, as well as the 70-odd public TAFE institutes. So that's point number one. Point number two, just as Australia has, as it were, merged private career colleges and public TAFE institutes, it has an enormous gulf between vocational education and training and what Australians call higher education or university education. It is almost flipped in North America. Colleges and universities are within the same policy framework of higher education. They have similar accreditation, quality assurance, financing arrangement. There are differences, of course, but a lot of the problems that emerge in Australian universities and Australian vocational education, and exactly the same sort of problems emerge in UK further education colleges and universities, because of this enormous divide between the sectors. On that point, North America does it much better. Australia is currently launching a review of universities. It does it frequently. Yet again, not one single little tiny word about vocational education. As if it didn't, it is mentioned so as to exclude them from the purview. And I don't know that there's been any review, policy change of one sector that's taken sufficient account of the other. And the same could be said for the UK. And I think that's causing a lot of the problems that Stephen's referring to.
Yes, superb points, Gavin. There is a disturbing parochialness about the way that we think about post-compulsory education in Australia. Perhaps that's the case everywhere else. I haven't worked in another country, but it's quite clear that the discourse in Australia has managed to cut itself off. It's cut itself off from international comparisons, cut itself off from areas like curriculum theory. We have competency-based training, but people don't see that in the context of other developments in theory, for example. So there is a disturbingly parochial mindset around post-compulsory education in Australia. It's profoundly disturbing to me.
Thank you. There were a few mentions of the intersection between higher education and vet in Australia in the chat. I don't know if people who commented on that want to comment and make their point again or elaborate.
I think go on, Robin, you do it.
Yeah, look, I happen to be sitting on the board of one of the newer universities in Australia, which is one of the largest, Western Sydney. And if I'm blunt, at the diploma level, we've killed TAFE and VET in Western Sydney, because basically we're open entry. The traditional TAFE cohort, which has been NESB, lower SES, basically we've got in the college now. I mean, TAFE's still got a very strong role at Certificate 3 and also things in literacy and numeracy. But basically, the attraction of the university is that it's cheaper and it's got better facilities. And I have to say, its pedagogy is very good. And at the overlap that Stephen dealt with, all the students who come into this preparatory course are enrolled in a diploma. But it's an HE diploma, not a VET diploma, so it's not competency based. And frankly, we couldn't do it if we were running VET diplomas rather than HE diplomas, because it would be too difficult to articulate, besides all the funding, regulations along those ways. So I think that's, in terms of more advanced courses in the TAFE sector, Bruce Mackenzie at Holmes Glen would want to kill me because they're very successful. But I think that the expansion of universities into low SES groups, and basically we're open entry at Western Sydney University, will take anybody, even if they go into preparatory course soon, has had a huge influence on the higher level work in TAFE. The other question I just wanted to ask Gavin, does that mean we've over-engineered the system in Australia? And does he think we should accredit less courses and maybe do challenge tests? And is that a problem or is that an advantage of the system?
I'll think about that for a while, Robin.
I mean, because certainly having spent hours and years of my life negotiating credit transfer universities between TAFE institutes I've run and universities, the take-up has been rather small. I sometimes now think, rather than negotiating a unit for unit credit transfer, had we just given a challenge test or had some other mechanism on an individual basis rather than these formal things, it might have been even more effective. But I don't know, just a question. I just wonder what your views were. So I'll be interested to read about it.
Lisa, you're muted. Lisa, you're still muted.
You think I would have got on top of this by now, wouldn't you? I was just going to make a little point about this, and then we can go to Michael. I think, I mean, I get very frustrated when I see the Australian discussions about credit transfer and pathways and articulation, because nothing has changed in friggin' 30 years, where we've been doing that sort of work. And in fact, I think it's got worse. I think Canada has got a particularly, even though that's very different in the different provinces, because of the reasons that Gavin outlined, and because the colleges here are strong institutions which are well embedded in their communities. I know my Canadian colleagues might, think I'm exaggerating a bit here, but compared to Australia, I tell you what they are. Canada has got the highest percentage of tertiary education attainment, which is diploma and above, in the world for the population aged between 25 to 64 years, and that is because of the college sector. So if you look at Canada's level of degree attainment, it is about the same as the OECD average. Where Canada goes to the top is because of its attainment of students with diplomas and advanced They have not solved the problem in Ontario of pathways and credit transfer, but I think it's less of an issue here than it is in Australia because they've got such strong colleges and where their students have such good outcomes. So that's just a little plug for Canada, I suppose.
Thank you. Okay, Michael Shasta.
Okay, hi everyone. So like my role here in TAFE, but I've also worked in different roles at Griffith and Griffith's Pathway College. And I guess one of the things to bring up is the distinctions between things like Certificate 3 as though that's a lower qualification than a diploma. I know that according to the Australian Qualification Framework, the AQF, it is level 3 as opposed to a level 5. But the volume of learning, for example, that goes into an apprenticeship to become an electrician compared to the volume of learning to do a diploma of business that you can do while you're in the 11th grade in high school here. So we have people graduating from high school with diplomas of business, AQF level 5, compared to say someone who then goes on to become an electrician, do their capstone exams. They graduate with a Certificate 3. I think we have to be a little bit wary when we start, comparing things like diplomas to Certificate 3. So I did take Robin's point, but the employability outcome for an apprentice that has finished an electrical trade compared to somebody who's 16, 17, finished a diploma of business while they were doing high school, it is incomparable. So with apprentices, they'll often only come to the TAFE college maybe 1 day a week over the year, or they might do a block of 6 weeks throughout their training or their apprenticeship. So when you think about it, how does that equate to FTE? Because effectively, if you have one apprentice coming to a TAFE college 1 day a week, that basically means you need 5 electrical apprentices to make up an equivalent FTE. I guess what I'm just saying is it's really difficult when you compare apples with oranges, unless you have a bigger overview of what the apprenticeship system is in Australia compared to the apprenticeship or journeyman system that applies in like North America. And I just thought that's just a point I just wanted to bring up when we are talking about these apples and oranges.
Could I just respond to that? Because I say I totally agree with you about the electrical trade certificate. And both employers, unions and teachers have told me that it should be worth a diploma, the electrical trade certificate, in terms of the understanding of maths. But it's another thing about Australia. The only rationale I've been told why it's not is because of industrial relations and awards considerations. And I think industrial relations and awards considerations are a big factor in the Australian vet system.
Can I just jump in as well? Michael, thanks for that observation and explanation. We would need multiple presentations to get to anywhere near that. I think we'd need to go back to Plato, and we'd need to look at the Republic and see how there's different forms of knowledge hierarchically presented. The Australian qualifications framework is actually very, very close to what Plato described in the Republic so long ago. Really, the Australian qualifications framework sets 2 cycles of expertise, one on top of the other. It makes no sense to do that, but that's what we've got. And of course, Robin's quite right as well. There are masses of practical issues here, and then some very deep philosophical ones all matched together.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I think, Lisa, we're running out of time a bit, and I would suggest that we stop here with our discussion. Thank you, Stephen, so much for this presentation. It was really fantastic. I had a whole list of questions, but I didn't need them. Thank you, all of you, for coming and participating, being part of this. I'll hand the word over to Lisa. Just a quick reminder to all of you, we have the next presentation on February 23rd from our colleague Claudia Schiebeck from Brazil on the federal institutes and the most recent model for VET in Brazil. You can see all the information on our website and our series web. Lisa.
So can I just conclude just with a couple of comments? First, on the next seminar in Brazil, I think that's going to be a really interesting seminar because Brazil has got a really interesting model. They've established these things called federal institutes, which are VET institutes, which serve senior school, tertiary level VET up to PhD. In the one institution. So it's going to be very interesting to hear how that has been developed and worked. And Claudia, Dr. Claudia Schiebeck, she was the first woman rector of one of these federal institutes. They're massive institutes. So I think that that will be a really interesting presentation. The only problem for people in Australia and New Zealand is that the time zone may not work all that well. So we will be recording that and putting it up on YouTube as we will from now on with all of these. I want to thank Stephen for a really interesting presentation. It really was great. And you actually generated some new lines of thinking, I think, by the way in which you looked at the broad role of the social purposes of it. And the way in which you linked notions of system design and curriculum to those broader social roles. I think that generates some new ideas for us to have a think about. And it was really good, of course, to get the Australian perspective. And I want to thank all the Australians who participated. I know it's very early there to be participating in a seminar like this. And finally, I'd like to thank the graduate assistants who organised all this and made it possible. Ahmed Su, there is, we can see a lovely picture behind him. Erin Anderson and Su Young Lee, the three graduate assistants are doing a wonderful, fantastic job in organising this whole series, and they are also taking the lead in organising a symposium that we're going to be holding on the 1st of June on the Community College Leadership PhD graduates and students research, reporting that back to their research community. And the theme of that reflects the broader theme that we've been developing on the social role of colleges, which is what is the role of Ontario's colleges in building the Ontario of tomorrow. So we're trying to look very broadly at that. And we're going to have a number of leaders from the college system, many of whom are graduates of our program, who'll be speaking at that. So everyone's invited to that as well. So thank you again to everyone. It's lovely to see all these Australian faces we haven't seen for a long time. I hope to see you all soon. And I hope to see those of you in the Northern Hemisphere at the Brazilian seminar in 2 weeks. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lisa.